So last week, just for fun, I gave you a look at Ohio's early voting numbers. And I say just for fun because Ohio is not a state that is in play this election, not a battleground state. So of course, the campaigns aren't pouring a lot of money into Ohio or spending a lot of time in Ohio. That makes sense. But there are states that do matter to these campaigns this election season, and those are the battleground states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. You get the idea. And so we are going to take a look at those states and their early voting numbers. But let's first start out with a broad overview from the University of Florida Election Lab. And then we're going to dive into some swing state early voting numbers from the Election Lab. So just giving you that first broad overview, this is a map of the United States put together by the lab, and what it's showing you is the states where the early voting turnout has been a bit higher compared to those states where it's been a bit lower. And you're going to notice on this map that some of those states with the higher voter turnout are actually swing states. Pennsylvania is one of them, Georgia's another, North Carolina's there. Those states, they have high early voter turnout according to this map, on top of the fact that they're swing states, which is something that should matter to these campaigns. We also have some data, just breaking it down by the numbers. And what that shows us is that 25.1 million and counting Americans have already cast their ballot in the presidential election. And there also is a breakdown by party. Democrats are outpacing Republicans in terms of early voting nationally by about 3%. And then following that, we have some unaffiliated voters, all making that total together 25 million plus Americans. A lot of early voting is happening. So let's get into the swing states. And we're going to go to Pennsylvania first because, of course. And so here the gap is a lot larger in terms of party affiliation early voting. You have Democrats that are ahead 57.8% to 31.6%. Quite a gap there. And then you have about 10% here in terms of those unaffiliated voters that have early voted. So Pennsylvania is the state that really matters most when we're talking about the Electoral College. 19 Electoral College votes. It could decide the winner of the election. And one thing I noticed in putting this story together, because I of course reviewed the data before sharing it with you, was that older voters are actually the biggest early voters. And that was true in each of these swing states, 65 plus voters. Looking at Pennsylvania, for example, 48.5% of their early voters are over 65. So that's pretty interesting to think about in terms of this election, that it could be those older voters that play a huge role in this election. Let's look at Wisconsin. There's limited data here, so we can't really say much, but that data exists from the University of Florida Election Lab, so maybe just kind of skim through by county if that's something you want to do. The data's there. We also have Michigan, which has some more data, than Wisconsin. And what we have here again is that similar trend of older voters having that higher early voting turnout. In this case, 49%. And then one other notable thing about Michigan's early voting numbers, over 50% of those early voters have been female so far, 55%. We're also going to go to North Carolina here, which is where we have some other early voting data. And what sticks out in this data set, the fact that Democrats and Republicans and those unaffiliated voters, they're pretty much even in terms of early voting. Let me point this out. They're actually about the same. We have 33% Democrats, 34% Republicans, 32% unaffiliated. That's a pretty even balance of Democrats, Republicans, and just independents that have cast their ballot in North Carolina early. So that is just pretty interesting to look at in terms of early voting there. Let's move on to Georgia, another swing state. And what we have here is something a little bit different in terms of age with regard to early voting. 41 to 65-year-olds, they're actually leading the pack in terms of Georgia's early voters. So that's something that's a bit different. And then we also have here something that's similar to what was going on in Michigan, women outpacing men in terms of early voting in Georgia. And now we go to Arizona, where Republicans are actually ahead of Democrats in terms of early voting there. Republicans ahead 42%, Democrats at 34.7%, and then we have those unaffiliated voters at 23.3%. And to wrap this tour of early voting in the swing states, we now go to Nevada. And here we have Republicans also ahead of Democrats in terms of early voting. Republicans at 40%, Democrats at 34.6%, and then those unaffiliated voters, 25.3%. Going into Election Day, which is now just 1 week out, pay attention to the swing states, because national polls, sure, that gives you an idea of how the country as a whole is feeling, but the swing states are the actual deciders. So those are the states you're going to want to pay attention to on election night. So really those other calls aren't as important as the swing state calls. Reporting in Toledo, Ohio with your early voting data from the University of Florida Election Lab, I'm Jaden Jefferson.